The silence in the hall is suffocating, the kind of silence that feels alive, tense. A silence that signals not peace but the gathering of a storm. The audience knows instinctively that what they are about to witness is not a conversation. It is a collision. The cameras pan across the stage, the lights intensify, and two figures stand on opposite sides like opposing forces of nature. On the left, Zohran Mamdani, a man who carries the voices of tenants evicted from their homes, workers chained to stagnant wages, families suffocated by medical debt. His eyes burn with urgency, his voice ready to ignite. On the right, Peterson, clinical psychologist, professor, and cultural lightning rod, a man who has dismantled arguments on stages across the world with surgical precision and an unflinching defense of responsibility and order. The contrast is so stark, it feels as though the room itself is trembling in anticipation. The tension snaps when Mamdani steps forward, his words exploding into the silence like thunder. We are told every day to endure, to survive in a system that celebrates freedom while leaving millions in poverty. Rents rise faster than wages, healthcare is sold as though it were a luxury item, and entire communities are abandoned while corporations flourish. We are told this is liberty, but freedom without dignity is no freedom at all. It is an illusion, a mask for cruelty. Dr. Peterson, you speak of personal responsibility. But tell me, what responsibility can a single mother uphold when her paycheck is devoured by rent and medical bills before she can feed her children? What responsibility can a worker bear when corporations exploit their labor and discard them like tools? You speak of resilience, but resilience without justice is suffering, dressed as virtue. The hall erupts instantly, the sound deafening, half the crowd leaping to their feet in applause while the other half boos with fury. The clash is not contained, it is spilling into every corner of the room. Peterson waits, his face calm, his posture unshaken. When he speaks, his voice cuts through the storm like a blade of ice. Zohran, the flaw in your argument is not compassion, it is compulsion. You see hardship and immediately assume the answer is control. You see suffering and decide that the solution is to redistribute it away. But suffering is not merely a problem to be eliminated, it is an inevitable part of existence. It teaches, it forges strength, it forces responsibility. When you attempt to shield people from all suffering, you do not liberate them, you infantilize them. You strip them of the chance to confront life, to grow, to find meaning. That is not justice. It is tyranny disguised as kindness. The words slice through the hall, the applause now coming from the other side of the crowd, cheers clashing with jeers. Mamdani does not hesitate, his voice sharper, louder, every sentence a hammer against steel. And what of the suffering that is unnecessary? What of the poverty created not by fate but by exploitation? What of the children whose futures are destroyed before they even begin because their schools are underfunded and their communities ignored? You call this suffering inevitable. I call it engineered. You dress injustice as a natural fact, but it is not nature. It is design. And if we refuse to intervene, we are not protecting liberty, we are protecting cruelty. His words crash like waves, the room shaking with the sound of divided outrage and support. Peterson raises his hand slightly, steady as a stone amidst the storm. But who intervenes, Zohran? Who decides what is unjust, what is unfair, what must be corrected? The very government you claim is corrupted by power? The bureaucrats who write policies from their desks with no understanding of the real world? You wish to solve inequality by granting power to those least trustworthy to wield it. That is not justice, it is chaos given structure. The freedom to rise, even from disadvantage, must never be replaced by a system that dictates outcomes. Because when outcomes are dictated, freedom dies. The audience gasps, the noise cresting into a roar. Both men stand locked in the center of the storm, their words ricocheting like lightning bolts across the stage. The battle lines have been drawn, and the first strike has landed with devastating force. The storm inside the studio swells as if the walls themselves are pulsing with the rhythm of two irreconcilable truths colliding. And Zohran Mamdani wastes no second in pressing forward, his voice charged like a siren cutting through midnight traffic as he says responsibility without power is an empty sermon, and choice without resources is a story told to those who were never invited to choose. Because a single parent cannot negotiate the price of insulin. A cashier cannot bargain with rent when the landlord raises it overnight. And a student buried in debt cannot purchase the future simply by believing harder. So when we speak of dignity, we must speak of the conditions that make dignity possible, of wages that do not evaporate, of homes that do not vanish with a notice on a door, of hospitals that do not turn human beings into invoices. And that is not infantilizing the public. Dr. Peterson, that is recognizing that a society is more than a classroom where pain is the curriculum and endurance is the final exam. And if justice means anything, it means we refuse to confuse needless suffering with moral growth, because there is no virtue in preventable harm and no wisdom in looking away while it multiplies. And the room trembles as applause collides with shouts, the moderator raising a hand to calm a sea that does not want calming, while Jordan Peterson leans toward the microphone with the steadiness of a surgeon and begins in a tone that is quiet enough to force the room to listen and sharp enough to hold it there as he argues that power centralized in the name of compassion often becomes power that cannot be restrained, that systems which promise fairness by decree frequently collapse under their own contradictions, and that human beings do not find meaning by outsourcing responsibility, but by shouldering it, step by step, day by day, because competence must be cultivated, and hierarchies, though imperfect, are often hierarchies of competence, not merely of oppression. And to pull them down without building better ones is to trade known burdens for unknown catastrophes. So the question is not whether suffering exists, but whether policy turns citizens into clients of a distant machine or into agents of their own lives. And a ripple of approval spreads across the right side of the audience, while Mamdani cuts in with urgency, insisting that the machine he fears already exists, and that it is not the public sector but the private megastructure of consolidated wealth, algorithmic platforms, and pricing power that moves like an invisible government through daily life, deciding what food costs, which neighborhoods rise, and whose voices trend. And if government must be scrutinized for overreach, then capital must be scrutinized for overrule, because a constitution that stops only the state is a shield with half its surface missing. And he drives the point harder, saying that when children's futures track zip codes more faithfully than their talents, we are not witnessing the beauty of ordered hierarchy, but the inertia of inherited advantage wrapped in moral language. And the front rows lean forward as Peterson answers in a measured cascade that the dangers Mamdani names are real, yet the remedy of command and control is a cure that often bleeds the patient. For markets can be corrected and refined, while centralized planning entrenches itself. In culture, family, school, faith, voluntary association does more to lift a child than any bureaucratic edict, because meaning grows from responsibility freely accepted, not assigned at scale. And when the state grows large enough to promise salvation, it grows too large to tolerate dissent, which is why liberty must remain the orbit in which justice travels if it hopes to avoid becoming compulsion. And the room hums with a restless electricity as Mamdani answers that liberty, which never lands on earth, is just a constellation admired from far away, because a hungry kid cannot eat abstractions, and a night shift nurse cannot pay rent with metaphors. So policy must be strong where life is fragile, must set floors beneath which people cannot fall, and that is not the end of responsibility, but the beginning of it, because only when survival is not a daily emergency can citizens build the competence Peterson rightly prizes. And he pivots to housing with numbers that sting, to wages whose buying power has thinned like paper in rain, to medicines whose prices climb ladders people cannot scale. And he says a society that treats essentials as luxury tests is a society that confuses scarcity for order, while Peterson replies with the cadence of a warning bell that scarcity is real and trade-offs are the law we cannot repeal, that generosity without discipline converts tomorrow's hope into today's applause, that debt and decay follow utopian arithmetic, and that compassion must be coupled to constraints or it devours the very capacity to care. And he concludes this movement with a plea for humility, that no single mind or ministry can compute the living complexity of millions of choices unfolding at once, which is why freedom is both risk and remedy, and the audience hangs there, suspended between thunder and ice as the moderator's voice finally breaks in to breathe. But the moment refuses to rest because both men are already drawing breath to strike again. And the question that hovers like heat above the lights is no longer who is right, but how a nation can carry justice without dropping liberty and carry liberty without losing justice. A balance so delicate it sounds impossible and yet so necessary, it feels like the only path left through the storm. The air in the studio feels like it could ignite from the sheer friction of two worldviews grinding against each other, and Zohran Mamdani seizes the moment with the urgency of someone who knows time itself is running out. His voice unrelenting as he declares that to speak of trade-offs without naming who pays the cost is to disguise injustice as inevitability, because the worker whose back bends under 12-hour shifts is already paying. The tenant evicted for the profit of a luxury development is already paying. The patient choosing between medicine and rent is already paying. So when we talk of scarcity, we must ask, scarcity for whom? Scarcity created by what decisions? Scarcity defended by whom? Because the shelves of billionaires do not run empty even when families ration meals. In calling this natural law is not humility, it is surrender. And the crowd roars, some in approval, some in anger, the sound pounding like a drum against the stage as Jordan Peterson raises his hand slightly, and the room tilts toward his calm precision. His voice cool yet heavy with force as he answers that indignation may rally crowds, but it cannot sustain civilizations. And while corruption and greed exist, the attempt to balance scales by force only multiplies resentment. Because prosperity is not a pie to be sliced thinner and thinner. It is a fire that grows when fed by responsibility, competence, and innovation. And when we pretend that redistribution alone will heal injustice, we risk extinguishing the fire that feeds everyone. And he leans in, his cadence sharp, insisting that the tragedies Mamdani names are real, but his remedies could produce catastrophes worse than the pain they aim to cure, because utopian promises of safety for all often lead to shortages, authoritarian control, and the silencing of the very people they claim to defend. Mamdani cuts in before the applause settles, his tone fierce, relentless, like a river breaking its banks, arguing that authoritarianism is not born from lifting people out of hunger, but from abandoning them to despair. That true tyranny is forcing millions to survive on the edge while calling it freedom. And that markets left unchecked are no less tyrannical than governments unchecked. Because when corporate monopolies set prices, dictate wages, and crush competition, liberty is already shackled, only it bows not to elected officials, but to invisible shareholders. And he thunders that democracy without economic justice is a stage play with scripts written by the wealthy. The audience bursts, clapping, booing, shouting, the noise like a storm tearing through steel, while Peterson steadies himself and replies with a rising cadence, his words pressing like a counterweight, that democracy collapses when liberty is sacrificed for imposed equality, because history is filled with revolutions that began in righteous anger and ended in repression, gulags, and graves. And though Mamdani may not mean it, the logic of enforced fairness always ends with someone deciding whose voice is too loud, whose wealth is too high, whose dream is too dangerous. And that is a road nations cannot afford to walk again. The crowd gasps, the invocation of history landing like a lightning strike, but Mamdani does not flinch, his voice breaking through the static with the fury of lived experience, answering that invoking gulags to dismiss demands for healthcare, housing, and wages is not history. It is fear dressed as wisdom, because people are not asking for chains. They are asking for bread, not for tyranny, but for dignity, not for domination, but for the chance to live without despair. And if a society cannot meet these basic demands without collapsing into authoritarianism, then perhaps it is not worth defending in its current form. The audience is on its feet now, the clash impossible to contain, their voices rising in chants and cries, and the cameras zoom tighter, capturing two figures locked not just in argument, but in a struggle over what it means to live free. Whether freedom is a shield strong enough to endure injustice, or whether freedom is incomplete without justice to give it meaning. A question so heavy it feels as if the entire hall itself is bending under its weight. The storm shows no sign of calming, the crowd a living organism, rising and falling with every blow of argument, and Zohran Mamdani seizes the wave of energy like a conductor commanding an orchestra of urgency, his words cascading in a torrent as he declares that freedom which ignores inequality is a mask for privilege, that to tell people suffering under systemic barriers that they must simply persevere is not encouragement but abandonment, because no amount of resilience will pay a bill that outpaces wages. No amount of grit will cure a disease in a nation where medicine is sold as luxury, and no amount of personal responsibility will balance scales tilted so heavily by history and wealth. And his voice cracks but does not falter, trembling with passion as he insists that government is not the enemy, but the only tool powerful enough to break the monopolies that strangle opportunity. The only shield strong enough to protect the weak against forces that do not answer to compassion, only to profit. The hall shakes with cheers, half the audience rising in ovation, while others boo with fury, their voices clashing like colliding thunderclouds. Jordan Peterson leans forward, his hands steady on the podium, his eyes fixed with icy clarity, his tone rising slowly, deliberately, each sentence built like a fortress, brick by brick. As he replies that the shield Mamdani praises so fiercely often becomes the very cage people cannot escape, that history is littered with governments that promised protection but delivered control, promised fairness but delivered oppression. And he declares that once liberty is surrendered in exchange for promises of justice, it is rarely recovered, because power concentrated in the hands of officials expands endlessly, and compassion enforced by bureaucracy becomes cruelty, not kindness. His words cut into the storm like cold wind, drawing loud cheers from his supporters. Mamdani fires back instantly, the words tumbling fast, his tone fierce but clear, saying that invoking the fear of tyranny to excuse existing suffering is itself a betrayal. That true cruelty is not in a safety net, but in letting people fall, not in building systems of protection, but in ignoring the collapse of communities. And he pounds the podium as he demands to know how liberty can mean anything to a child too hungry to learn or a worker too exhausted to dream, declaring that freedom cannot live in the abstract. It must live in the real, in the homes and streets and lives of ordinary people. The room erupts, some shouting with raw energy, others shaking their heads violently, the clash raw and primal. Peterson does not wait for silence, his tone sharpened like a blade, insisting that real change must come not from systems imposed from above, but from meaning embraced from within, that people need responsibility to carry, burdens that make them stronger, not endless guarantees that weaken their resolve. And he warns that if the state promises to erase every hardship, it will erase the very character that sustains a society. His words thunder like a warning bell, but Mamdani surges forward again, his conviction unshaken, his declaration booming across the hall that responsibility without justice is a hollow sermon, that character cannot be cultivated in starvation, that resilience is not the absence of aid, but the triumph that comes when aid clears a path for potential to grow. And he concludes that a society which celebrates struggle while refusing to lessen it confuses cruelty for virtue. The audience roars. The cameras zoom closer, capturing two faces illuminated by fire and ice, one burning with rage for justice, the other carved with determination to defend liberty. And the air feels like it is moments from breaking apart, as if the weight of their words alone could split the world into two visions of the future. The storm inside the studio has become a tempest that feels larger than the stage, larger than the city, as if the very nation itself is trembling under the weight of the words being hurled back and forth. The audience is no longer seated. They are standing, shouting, clapping, booing, their voice a tide that refuses to be contained. Zohran Mamdani raises his hand, not to calm the storm, but to ride it, his voice booming across the hall with the force of a verdict. Dr. Peterson, you argue that liberty is enough, that suffering refines the human spirit, that resilience grows from hardship. But resilience is not the same as justice. People do not need suffering to find meaning. They need dignity. What meaning does a child find in hunger? What lesson is learned by a family bankrupted by medical bills? What wisdom comes from eviction notices, from empty fridges, from untreated sickness? These are not the fires that forge character. They are the fires that burn lives to ashes. And when leaders refuse to act, when they dismiss preventable suffering as inevitable, that is not philosophy. It is complicity. The crowd erupts, chants of Mamdani's name thundering from one half of the room while the other half shouts in protest, their clash almost drowning him out. Jordan Peterson waits, eyes narrowed, his voice calm but razor-sharp as he cuts through the uproar. Zohran, you misunderstand me. I do not glorify suffering. I recognize it as part of life that cannot be erased by decree. When you promise to eliminate all hardship, you promise the impossible. And impossible promises lead only to disillusionment and tyranny. The danger of your vision is not your compassion. It is your conviction that compassion can be engineered. But human beings do not thrive when they are shielded from every difficulty. They thrive when they bear responsibility, when they confront reality, when they discover strength within struggle. Liberty gives them that chance. Bureaucracy steals it. His words land like steel, his supporters roaring, the hall shaking as the two visions crash once again. Mamdani does not yield, his voice now raw with urgency, trembling not with weakness, but with conviction that feels carved from the cries of millions. And I say liberty without justice is not liberty at all. What you call protection from tyranny, I call abandonment to cruelty. What you describe as responsibility is too often just survival forced upon the poor, while the powerful enjoy freedom unchallenged. Justice is not engineering. It is humanity codified into law. And a nation that refuses to guarantee its people food, shelter, and care does not defend liberty. It destroys it. Because freedom without dignity is not freedom, it is privilege dressed in principle. The audience roars so loudly the microphones struggle to contain the sound. The cameras capturing faces twisted in awe, in anger, in passion. Peterson slams back, his voice now raised, his cadence quickening, the storm at full pitch. And justice without liberty is not justice. It is control. You may not mean it, but your path leads to systems that silence dissent, to governments that grow too large to restrain, to promises that collapse under their own weight. Liberty is the condition for justice, not its enemy. And when liberty dies, justice dies with it. The two stand frozen in defiance, their words hanging in the air like lightning, refusing to fade. The audience roaring with divided fury, their chants colliding in a cacophony that feels unstoppable. The moderator, barely audible, calls the debate to a close, but the energy cannot be shut off. It spills out of the studio, into the streets, into living rooms across the country. As the cameras cut and the lights dim, one question remains, echoing in the silence that follows the storm. Will the future belong to liberty without justice, or justice without liberty? And the nation, breathless, waits for the answer.